Hello, my name is Arjan and welcome to Atelier AG. In this video, I will be showing you how I went from this illustration to this sculpture. Enjoy! This is the illustration I used as a reference. I remember I was sketching a bird skull on a piece of packing cardboard and it somehow turned into this monstrosity. I had no plan beforehand, I just let it happen, and the result is a creature that seems to be made up of different kinds of animals. This is why I decided it could be some kind of nature-based spirit or maybe a demigod. I started by cutting out a square of 18mm multiplex and traced the outline on a piece of paper. I then started sketching out the crater and the creature inside it. This was just to get an idea on how big the creature would end up to be. I also traced the side of the multiplex and sketched out the side view of the monster. This will help me later when I start to make the armature. Something I wanted to try for this build was lighting. I bought these LED fake candles that have a nice flickering light, and I will add them inside the crater for a glowing effect out of the smoke. I used the sketch I made of the top view to mark out the place of the crater on the wooden base and decided the placement for the two LEDs. I then used a hole saw to drill out the spaces for the LEDs and used some milliput to put them in place. To create the volume of the rocks, I used tinfoil that I then covered with Sculpting. I textured the inside of the crater with a rock and the hills with a toothbrush. The toothbrush leaves a nice light texture on the hills that would otherwise be unnaturally smooth.
It was at this moment he knew. He fucked up.
At that point I realized a stupid mistake I made. Sculpey is a clay that cures in the oven, but I already attached the LEDs. I did not want to redo the base, so I decided to just bake it all together, hoping that the LEDs would survive. Apparently they don't, so I had to break out the partially molten LEDs and put in two new ones. With the base ready, it was time to start working on the armature. The creature would be attached only by its spine, which meant I needed something stronger than just a metal wire. I will show you how I achieved this. I took out my drill and attached a screw eye instead of a drill bit. I threaded a long piece of metal wire through the eye and grabbed the two ends with a plier. I put some tension on the wire and gently started turning the drill. This will create a twisted wire which is a lot stronger than just a single one. I then used the twisted wire to create the spine of the armature. The end of the wire that was attached to the screw eye gives me a great ring onto which I can attach the head afterwards. I intentionally left the other end longer than necessary so I could mount it in my sculpting clamp. For the arms, I thought it might be a good idea to use the twisted wire as well. I used my sketch to make sure both arms are the same length. This is very important because I can't change the armature after I started sculpting. I attached the arms to the spine with a thinner wire that I wrapped around both pieces a few times. I had some difficulty to keep the arms on the same place, so I decided to use some milliput to bond them together. To be very sure that it cured into the position I wanted, I temporarily put the armature onto the base and left it to cure like that. For the hands, it was very important to get the armature as thin as possible while still be strong enough to sculpt onto. I sketched out one of the hands next to my reference sketch to be sure the scale would match, and I then used a single piece of wire for each of the hands. I used a single piece because I didn't want to run into the same problem I had when I attached the spine and the arms together. Another added benefit is that I don't have to worry about the pose of the hand, but only the dimensions. If the hand is made out of one piece, I can just bend it into the right pose afterwards. The two ends of wire coming from the hands can then easily be used to attach them to the arms. I just twisted them around and they were fixed in place. After making and attaching the head in a similar fashion, I decided to put on a first layer of green stuff sculpting putty. This first layer makes it a lot easier to sculpt because it can sometimes be difficult to get the putty to stick onto the metal wire. At the same time, I could be sure that the separate pieces of the armature remain in place. The next step was to make the ribs, and since they are all long and thin, I had to make an armature for each individual rib. I decided to glue them on with superglue and reinforce them with baking soda. The baking soda reacts with the superglue so that it immediately sets and adds more glue surface for extra strength. In hindsight, I wish I sculpted the ribs before attaching them to the spine, because sculpting them was incredibly tedious because of the limited space. In the end, it was easier to do a sloppy layer of green stuff and then file and sand the ribs smooth after it had cured. At this point, the armature was ready to start sculpting. I decided to get the hard part out of the way and start with the spine. Because of the ribs being in the way all the time, it was quite annoying and difficult to film, but basically I sculpted each vertebrae and added a small bump on each of them. I continued on with the head. Here you can clearly see the way I sculpt. I add small pieces of clay at a time and work them into the shape that I want. Then I look to see where I might need more or less clay and rework the shape. It's a constant process of adding or removing clay and moving it around until it looks the way I want it. With the green stuff I used for this project, you have a limited working time. After about 30 minutes I can feel that it's starting to cure, but you can continue working it for another 15 minutes. After that, it takes a couple of hours to fully cure. Using a clay or putty that is cured in an oven gives you basically unlimited working time, and this gives you the opportunity to rework shapes endlessly, but for this project it wouldn't be ideal because of all the pointy bits that can get damaged quite easily. Of course, it's very much possible that you might want to change something after the green stuff is set. I didn't like the length of the beak, for example, so I just cut it off and sculpted it again. It's also possible to sand some pieces smooth, file them, or use a rotary tool to rework your cured sculpt. For the horns, I first sculpted a smooth layer to get the shape right. I then used a thin sculpting tool to press in the texture. I then started working on the arms. An easy way to sculpt the muscles is to put them on separately on the armature. Like this you can already see if the proportions are right or if you want to add or remove some clay. When you're satisfied with the result, you can blend the pieces together with sculpting tools. The claws of these creatures were difficult to sculpt, but I feel like they turned out great. I wanted to make the claws as thin and creepy as possible, but this meant I had to sculpt a lot of intricate details with very limited amount of clay. I started by sculpting a smooth layer, ending in pointy tips for the nails. I left this layer to cure and then started sculpting the tendons. After the tendons had cured, I worked on the knuckles, and after that I added a small ring to separate the nail and fingers. The reason I let each part cure before continuing was that I didn't want to damage the work I had already done. Also, if you work on a small piece like this and everything is still soft, it can be very hard to keep the clay in place. You can kind of see it as if you were saving your video game to keep the progress you've already made. The fur was quite easy to sculpt. I just put on a layer of clay on all the places where I wanted the fur and dragged a pointy sculpting tool through it. The result is great and it takes very little effort. Here you see me attaching the monster to its base, and I really wish I didn't do that. Painting this monster really became a nightmare because of it. It would have been a lot easier to paint the two pieces separately and assemble them afterwards. But hey, at least I learned something. And so it was time to start painting. I started out with a layer of glossy white paint in the crater. My idea was to have as much reflection as possible for a bigger glowing effect from the LEDs. I don't think it made a big difference in the end, but at least the white layer made it easier to create the smoke effect later on. Here the struggle of painting this model really started. The black primer was still quite easy to paint, but when I started on the ribs I realized I had made a mistake. In the end it worked out, but it was still very annoying. My initial idea for the arms was to first paint the complete arms in grey tones and to then add the colors with ink. Ink is translucent, so theoretically the grey tones would show through. It didn't really work out because I didn't thin down my inks, and especially with the black rings of the arms it was very hard to see the shadows and highlights. However, the little bit of grey tones I did see really helped when working on the shadows and highlights afterwards. Otherwise, I would have had to add color and lighting for each separate band of color, while still having smooth shadows and highlights between different colors. As I said, sculpting the fur was quite easy, and fortunately painting it was no different. I started with a white base coat, followed by a black part on the bottom. The white was still a little bit wet, so I could wet blend the black and white a little bit. And to add some color, I added a brown wash. To highlight the individual strands of hair, I gave the fur an off-white dry brushing, and for an extra highlight on the topmost parts, I did a second dry brushing with a pure white. Here is a close-up of the work I did on the head. Unfortunately, I forgot to press record when I worked on it, so I have no footage. With the neck, I wanted to have a similar texture as in my reference drawing to really make it look like scaly lizard skin. To achieve this, I put on a dark green base coat and stippled in lighter green colors while it was still wet. The higher I got on the neck, the lighter I would make my paint. I also added some patches of skin on top parts of the skull to make it seem like it used to be covered in scales altogether. Each patch is first painted with a layer of dark green and then a layer of lighter green, leaving a little bit of dark on the edges. This adds a little contrast between the bone and the skin. On my reference illustration, I drew a person, but I felt like he was a little bit boring. For this sculpt, I wanted him to be a lot more expressive, so I sculpted this tiny little man. I tried to film the sculpting process, but it was just too tiny. I drilled in a small hole in the base and glued him in place. Painting the hills was a lot of fun. I put on a base coat and while it was still wet, I blended in darker and lighter spots to create shadows and highlights. I focused the highlights around the crater to really make it look like it's shining. To really bring home the light coming from the crater, I added a dark drop shadow behind the person. I tried out the loaded brush technique for this. Basically, you fill your brush with a color that is already on your model, in my case a bluish green, and you add just a little bit of color that you want to blend in the tip of your brush. I used a dark brown for this, and I started at the feet of the man and gently feathered the paint away from him. It took some practice, but I'm quite happy with the result. One of the last steps was adding the smoke effect inside the crater. I did some tests with different materials and I ended up using cotton balls and acrylic gel. I used the gel to glue the cotton in place and I painted a diluted layer on top of the cotton to get rid of the fluffy hairs. When this dried, I gave it a light blue wash in some places and a white dry brushing to finish it. I'm not sure how I feel about the smoke in the end. I feel like it could be better, but overall I'm satisfied with the result. Let me know if you have any ideas on how I could improve it. After adding some details like rocks and grass, this sculpt was complete. I made some big mistakes in the process, but it turned out great in the end. Unfortunately, the light coming from the LEDs is not what I had hoped for. Anyway, I'm still super pleased with it and I would love to hear your thoughts on it. Leave a comment and if you want to see more of this, please subscribe. Here are some close-up shots for you to enjoy.